Hi everyone, Carl Steele here, English 3111, fall 2022 for Brooklyn College, talking about the book of Esther for the Middle English Metrical Paraphrase of the Old Testament. I have an image here of from the Speculum Humanae Salvationis, the Mirror of Human Salvation, which is illustrating here Esther at a feast. I'm particularly fond of the dog with the bone running away at the bottom. The mid-15th century illustration. So you may have been taught that in the Middle Ages, people read the Bible only in elite languages, and that most people, therefore, didn't read the Bible. They had to be highly educated, and that the church was extremely jealous about who was allowed to read it and who wasn't allowed to read it. This is correct in some ways, but it is largely an incorrect story. We have translations of the Bible from very early on out of its original languages, so out of Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek about 2,300 to 2,200 years ago for the benefit of largely Greek-speaking Jews living in Egypt. This is Septuagint. And then we have for the Christians, of course, Jews continue to read the Bible in Hebrew from the earliest days all the way through to the present. We have a translation from Greek into a language called Gothic, about 1,700 years ago. This is an East German language, and the only surviving evidence we have for this language is, in fact, this Gothic Bible. We have translations into Old English from about 1,000 to 1,200 years ago. This is done out of Latin. I'll talk about the Latin translation on the next slide. We have, especially beginning in the 12th century, prose summaries and commentaries. These tend to concentrate not on the allegorical or the symbolic sense, that is the kind of saying Noah's Ark represents the cross and things like this, but instead just on the literal sense, just telling what the story is and explaining difficult names. We have metrical paraphrases, which more or less take these prose summaries and turn them into verse, and there are versions of this I know of in German and in French, and of course in Middle English, like the ones we're reading. And then there are just straight up prose translations, often just done directly, well, not directly, but from the Latin, for example. And so we have a French one pictured here on this slide, and I've transcribed a little bit of the French and also translated that. So this is the very beginning of the Book of Esther. And you will see, if you have the Book of Esther in front of you, this is not really identical to the work that's in the Bible, because it's also drawing in some of the material from the prose commentaries that were popular in the Middle Ages. And ours is a metrical paraphrase. It's a version to verse. It's part of a larger paraphrase of most of the narrative material of the so-called Old Testament. And this was done in West Yorkshire, so it's quite a bit ways north of London, around the year 1380. It's not hugely popular. We have only 2 manuscripts surviving, neither of which have been digitized, one of which is held in a private collection by a British aristocrat, in fact. But we do know that it was used and read because the people who put together a collection of plays called the York Mystery Cycle. Mystery, because a mystère is a trade, a craft, and each craft had its own play it was responsible for. The butchers did, the goldsmiths did, and so on. They used this particular paraphrase to help build their biblical drama for the city of York. In this manuscript, or this work that you're reading for this week, the dialect is going to be a little bit strange, possibly. The Yorkshire dialect is being used here. The O, letter O, sound O is often used where Southern English would have used E, so not she, but sho for the feminine third-person pronoun. It'll use A and D instead of ing for the endings of verbs. And E, as we've just seen, is often pronounced O. So one of the effects of that is that the word where is often spelled whore, W-H-O-R-E. So please don't get hung up on that. And that is what's happening. It's a dialectical form. So to talk a little bit in more detail about certain translations, I have 4 different translations represented here. We have a translation from Hebrew into English. We have a translation into Latin, the Latin Vulgate. I'll say more about that in just a moment. We have a translation from the Vulgate into English, the so-called Douay-Rheims translation. And we also have the Middle English translation, which I will conclude this slide talking about. So, of course, Hebrew is the earliest version of the Book of Esther, but there's also a Greek version that's quite early that is slightly different narratively. And we have about 1,600 years ago, translation by Jerome into Latin, into the so-called vulgar tongue, that is the common tongue, the language that is commonly used by everyone in the Western Roman Empire, which is Latin. So when Jerome translates the Bible out of Hebrew, out of Aramaic, and out of Greek into Latin, he is not trying to produce a Bible that can be read by very few people, but rather he's producing a Bible that can be read by many people. And this Latin Vulgate translation is the primary Bible that's read by Roman Catholics in Western Europe, really all the way through the Middle Ages. If you want to get a sense of what that is in that Bible, and you don't want to learn Latin, what you can do is you can read the Douay-Rheims translation. That is named after a couple of places in France where English-speaking scholars translated the Latin Vulgate into English in the late 16th and early 17th century. So almost contemporary, but a little bit earlier than the King James translation of the Bible. So you can read the Douay-Rheims and get a sense of what it was that medieval Roman Catholics were reading without having to learn Latin. We also have here the Middle English Bible. It's pretty obvious that it was translated not out of the original languages, but out of the Latin Vulgate. That's easy to demonstrate simply on the basis of the mistakes in the translation. So there are some points where I thought the language was a little bit weird. I looked at the Latin version, and I went, aha, that's why they said that. So this is why he said princes and children instead of princes and servants, because the Latin, for example, says et pueris suis and his children, but pueris could also be read as servants. The correct translation there would be servants. So we know that the original language that this person's relying on, which is Latin. So it's not directly out of Hebrew, or for that matter, out of Greek. This particular Bible, this late 14th century Middle English Bible, has often been mistakenly called the Wycliffite Bible because it's been associated historically with a man named John Wycliffe, who was a university scholar of an unorthodox mindset, who had a lot of attitudes about the independence of church and state, and whether or not, say, the Eucharist was literally the body of Christ, and so on. And for these beliefs, he was eventually condemned posthumously. He was already dead, but his bones were dug up and they were burned and they were thrown in a river. And one of the things that came about because of John Wycliffe, according to certain people, is the eventual Protestant break with the Roman Catholic Church. That's a pretty simple story, and in certain ways kind of incorrect. But the thing that is most obviously incorrect, and this has been demonstrated by a man named Henry Asgar Kelly, a very old but very distinguished professor at UCLA, in his book, The Middle English Bible, a reassessment from 2016, he's demonstrated conclusively that this Middle English Bible has nothing whatsoever to do with John Wycliffe. So if you look on Wikipedia, for example, and other places online, they're not keeping up with the scholarship, and they think this Bible has something to do with Wycliffe. It doesn't. It's a completely orthodox production, probably produced for the benefit of scholars who are going to university who don't want to learn Latin to read the Bible because they have other goals in terms of their career. It spreads widely throughout England. We have about 250 manuscripts surviving. There is no other Middle English work that survives in so many copies. And there is a lot of attempt over the 15th century to try to crack down on unorthodox beliefs in England. So you do have English people being burned as heretics for the first time in the 15th century. And there's a real crackdown on unauthorized translations of the Bible. That key word there is unauthorized. You could bring a translation to your local church authority and have it basically authorized. They can determine that it's a good translation, one that's reliable, and one that is not going to lead you astray. And so long as you didn't basically try to set yourself up as a preacher, and so long as you didn't violate church expectations by, say, eating meat on a Friday in a really public way, you would probably be fine. But over the course of the later 15th century, we really start to see an increasing fear and hostility to around Orthodox Christian belief. And eventually this cracks, and we get Martin Luther, we get Henry VIII, and we get all of that. But I think the main thing is I don't want you to be led astray. We do have a widely available Middle English version of the Bible from the late 14th century through most of the 15th century, hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts. It's read many, many places without people getting in trouble at all. Now, the version we're reading, however, is not that line-for-line translation. It is a metrical paraphrase produced, as I said, in Yorkshire around 1380. And so I have here the very first stanza of that. The rhyme scheme is, as you see, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, and then C, D, C, D. And you'll see that the C, D, C, D, the last 4 lines are read. They're a little bit shorter metrically than the rest of the stanza. So here's how it goes. Here me men look who likest to leer of solace and of sorrowing of soul, who that this world once ever and where, from woe to wella, from wella to woe, of a rich king hight Esther, and of his weaves, for he had two, both were they queens, species and Sarah, when Vashti hight that one of thou, the other Hester hight, and als learned men may look after her name full richt, this is called Hester book. So about the vocabulary. Lera, to learn, solace, second line, comfort, who that this world wounds ever and where. Wounds is from an Old English verb, which gets us the phrase, as was his wont, as was his habit. We can translate that as continues to be, and in wera, in disorder, from woe to wella, from woe to well, from bad to good, from bad to prosperity. How this world continues ever always in disorder, from unhappiness to prosperity, from prosperity to unhappiness. Bises and Sarah, both were the quenas, Bises and Sarah, in various times. So Vashti was a wife, a queen initially, and then Hester stepped in when the king was upset with Vashti. And then we have that verb hicht, H-E-Y-G-H-T. The closest analog now is the modern German heißen. So if I wanted to introduce myself to a German person, I might say, Ich heiße Karl. My name is Karl. I am called Karl. And so Queen Vashti heicht that one of those. One of them was called Queen Vashti. The other Hester heicht, the other one was called Esther. So that's what that verb means, is called or is named. And here we have an illustration. This is from a 15th century Dutch manuscript of a work called The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, which I often teach. And it gives you a picture of what we're talking about, of a world that is continuing ever in disorder, uncertainty, from unhappiness to prosperity, from prosperity to unhappiness. This is the wheel of fortune. In modern English, if we talk about fortune, we normally mean only good fortune. We wish someone good fortune, wish someone wins a fortune. But fortune in the Middle Ages is understood as that kind of random quality that means that everything that we think of as settled is constantly in the process of changing, particularly in terms of matters of happiness and unhappiness. So here is a person who's very happy because he's sitting in a position of absolute power, but then fortune turns her wheel. And he goes down towards woe. And then he moves up towards prosperity again, and so on. The only thing we can be sure of in this world is that nothing is certain, or the only thing that is certain is that eventually happy people will end up unhappy, and unhappy people will end up happy. There is no end to the ever-turning wheel of fortune. And this is why in most of these major religious traditions, they say you need to look to the eternal thing. They believe that there's something eternal out there, and that eternal thing is God. So the only way to escape from fortune and the false promises that fortune offers us, and even the false unhappiness that fortune offers us, is to look towards eternity. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about genre. So talking about this first stanza of Esther versus the last stanza. So what it's doing here in these first 4 lines is it's introducing us to how it is we're supposed to read this work. It's identifying a genre. And here I'll read it in modern English, my translation. Here men may look who like to learn about joy and sorrow too, how this world always continues to be an uncertainty, from woe to prosperity and from prosperity to woe. This reminded me of some lines from The Monk's Tale by Chaucer from the Canterbury Tales. And so I'll read this in Middle English. Tragedy is to saying a certain story, as olde books maken us memory, of him that stood in great prosperity, and is he fallen out of he degree into misery, and endeth wretchedly. So it's suggesting the genre of tragedy. Tragedy, according to the monk here, is to say a certain story, as old books tell us historically, put into our memory, about a person who stands in great prosperity and falls out of their high status into misery, and they end wretchedly. And then later on in the work, This word fortune appears many, many times in the Monk's Tale. Thus can fortune, her wheel govern and he, and out of joy bring men to sorrow. Thus can fortune, her wheel govern and guide, and out of joy bring men to sorrow. So the primary lesson of fortune is that whatever happiness you have is temporary. And so the opening stanza of this seems directed at Haman, the person who is, of course, the chief advisor to the king, and he is in great happiness, and he's going to end, of course, in extreme unhappiness. He's going to be hanged and punished for the cruelty he wants to visit on the Jews. And so that seems to provide one way of reading this work, to say this is a story about not being too comfortable, because anyone who exists here in worldly prosperity, that'll eventually turn on them, because that is a lesson of fortune. But the ending provides us with a different kind of understanding of how this work is supposed to work. And so let me read a few lines from the last stanza of this work. Thus whoso will the sakeless shama for any lordship in this land, upon themselves shall fall the sama, or worse. Thus may we well understand. Thus whosoever shall will shame against the innocent, the sinless, in order to win any kind of lordship, the same thing will fall on them, or worse. We may well understand this. So this is a totally different lesson than we have in the opening stanza. This final lesson is a very kind of pat moral lesson, saying if you try to do something cruel to people who are innocent, the same thing will be inflicted on you. There is justice. The world makes sense. Everything lines up perfectly. The wicked will be punished. But the first stanza is offering us something quite differently, saying anybody who is happy in this world because of the way fortune works will end up unhappy, and so on. Nothing is reliable. And I guess the question is, which one of these things is offering a more compelling reading of Esther? Is it the kind of simple moral lesson of the ending, or is it the story about fortune? And I think we have a little bit of conflict here in how we're supposed to read this work. I'm looking forward to our conversation about this on Wednesday. Thank you.